Hey team, Grant Hagen here with Reality Capture Live. Thanks for tuning in again with us. If this is your first time, welcome in. We are so glad that you guys are here joining in with us today. If you have been here before, welcome back. We are excited that you're joined in with us here for another amazing conversation. We have just been having a ton of fun with these, one of which today is going to be just as fun with some really good friends that we have slated for this conversation. Just want to go over a couple quick things. We do this every time just to kind of kick us off and get things started, which is really just what we're going to be talking about today. We have two great friends with Ted and Jay that are in talking about this topic of inspections. This topic, again, is just another one of those that when we were thinking about this idea of Reality Capture Live, what is it that we wanted to talk about? What were some of the key things that we hear from you? This is all user-generated, user-intended topics that we want to cover. And inspections is just one that keeps coming up. And the cool part about this is that there's just so much to talk about here from different types and applications. And really, we just thought, man, who would be the best people to come in and talk about this? And we have an awesome conversation slated with Ted and Jay to talk about some of that. And so really just to, again, give you guys an idea of join the conversation. I see some of you guys that are in here on the chat already. If you were here last time, we brought back our dinger. So if you have some questions, want to ding those up down in the comments below. Tell us where you're tuning in from. These really are intended to be just super collaborative and really just fun conversations. We do these live. If in case you didn't know, this is not pre-recorded. Jay's about to get on a flight to head back from a conversation he's been spending with a customer, and Ted joined in with us in his busy schedule as well. So we just appreciate those guys coming in here as well. But really, why Reality Capture Live? Why have we done this? What you can expect, how you can engage. Really, a core value here at DroneDeploy is simplify. And we hear this all the time about this topic of reality capture. What does it mean? How do I get the most out of it? And really, we just want to bring simplicity to reality capture. That's the idea behind this in the topics that we pick, in the folks that we bring on this conversation. And so that's really the why Reality Capture Live. What you can expect if you've, again, been here before, you can see some familiar faces up here. All of these folks are just truly experts in the space. This is just such a really fun time to bring these experts in, and really that same goal and mission in mind is really simplifying reality capture. And so that's really what you can expect. And then how you can engage. Again, I see a lot of the comments coming down here as well. So appreciate it. We'll add a little dinger there. Tell us where you're tuning in from. This is really exciting and fun to see. And just excited that you guys are tuned in here with us. So with that, I want to bring in our guests, Jay and Ted, for this conversation. Appreciate you guys tuning in here. Jay, thanks for making the time before flight. And Ted, great to see you, man. It's really cool that you look a little different from maybe some LinkedIn images as well. But hey, we appreciate you guys making the time. So thanks for coming in.
My pleasure. Thanks. I was waiting for that one to hit. There should be a dinger for every time my beard is brought up in one of these, but it's great.
I love it. I think it looks great. And Jay's clean cut over there too. He's looking fresh coming off of a job site, which we appreciate there too. So yeah, this is going to be a great time. One, I blew past your guys' intros here, but one, just wanted to give us a little background of your work over at SkyDeploy and kind of how you got into some of this inspection space. And then Jay, I'll kind of kick it over to you as well.
Yeah, I got in as a drone service provider back in 2017. I really wanted to be involved in this industry, and I thought that the only way I can really do that is to just get started and buy a drone and see what I can create. And I've just been enamored by it ever since. I wake up thinking about it. I go to sleep thinking about it. So it's been a really great journey because I love doing this work. And I love working with the types of customers and also the data. That's like what really gets me excited is all of the interesting types of data, and that's evolving very quickly. But yeah, SkyDeploy has been the vehicle that I chose to do that. And I swear I did not copy your name. I didn't know about DroneDeploy when I chose SkyDeploy. So I'm a little title at the bottom now. I'm like, oh, this looks weird, but promise, it's totally a coincidence.
Hey, that's all good stuff. I blew past your intro slide here, and I can't believe that I missed it. One, because Ted has broken LinkedIn's algorithms probably 4 or 5 different times. If you don't follow him on LinkedIn, would highly encourage you to do that. There is just some amazing content that he's putting out, really just around, again, this idea of simplifying reality capture, what it means in this space specifically for inspections. And so I would encourage you guys to follow Ted and all the posts that he has here as well. So Ted, I just want to highlight that. I'm pretty sure I've seen some of your posts grow from like oh, it's out, maybe a week or so, and it's got 100 or so likes. But all these posts appear 1,000 plus. And man, I think the most encouraging thing is how much you engage on the comment thread. That often gets missed a lot in some of these posts as well. So if you haven't met Ted, highly encourage you to go over there and check out a lot of the content that he's doing. And Jay doesn't need as much of an introduction on the DroneDeploy team, but Jay is our Director of Solutions Engineering. And I'm sure many of you who are tuning in have either met him, had an email from him, or been on a webinar with him. So Jay, appreciate you coming in and joining in the conversation.
Thank you, Grant. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's going to be really fun. We've had a couple of Jay's team members on this before. If you remember Adam from our accuracy conversation, who Jay has just been an amazing resource, not only for our team, but all the teammates that he helps lead and direct as well. So guys, I want to get right into this because one, this has been a topic that I've been looking forward to. It was really my first introduction into reality capture itself from the aerial side and doing inspections. There is so much stuff to cover here. And the format that we've kind of followed here is, hey, what's the definition, or how do we kind of define this? And I think even as we were all kind of discussing this, it was kind of interesting of like, how do we tackle this idea of an inspection? There's a couple different ways to do it. And I kind of want to kick it over to you first, Ted, of just what does this idea of inspection mean to you? You've obviously seen it from a lot of ground applications and aerial applications as well. And kind of just want to give you the mic a little bit of how you explain to folks how they should be thinking about what the term inspection means.
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's more complicated than it seems. There's a ton of different assets, a ton of different things that you could be inspecting. And from my perspective, I've been in the drone world the whole time. So when I think about inspections and how to deliver a proper inspection, usually the first place I go to is I go and I read the inspection manual for that specific asset or for that specific task. Because ultimately, we're supposed to be replicating the traditional method, but just enhancing it and providing more value there. At the end of the day, a bridge is a bridge is a bridge, tower is a tower. There's very important aspects of each inspection, but there's little overlap in the very fine technical details of how to conduct that inspection. So I found myself not only needing to understand how to do it with the technology that we're using now, but also how to do it in a way that the end user, the engineer or that architect, they get everything they need from it, including the things that they're used to getting. And not just, expect them to be super excited about it just because it is this cool technology that was used. So, I'm still learning lots because there's a lot of layers to unpack here.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing you bring up too, and something that we talked a little bit about before we came on here is, inspections have been around for a long time, right? They're nothing new. They're in a lot of manuals, which we'll, talk about as well as just, being requirements of different things. But the methods to doing that is very new. And Jay, I know you kind of have a fun story that I kind of want to tee up here for you of just how far we've come from this idea of inspections. It is interesting because when you start to talk about this topic, you realize it's not very new in its kind of need, but what is new is kind of the means and methods for it. So I'm going to tee you up here a little bit for a fun story that you always reference, I feel like, when we always talk about this idea.
Yeah, I think I've told this story a few times, but I found it really interesting when I'd heard about it for the first time as well. And this is more just talking about aerial inspections. And I've been a drone nerd for about 10, 15 years now as well. But there have been drone nerds, or at least aerial inspection nerds in the space for over a century. And this is a fun little story for those of you that haven't heard about it. But some of the first technology that was ever used, and technology is a loose word that I use there, for aerial inspections was pigeon cameras. There's a guy goes by the name of Julius Nonbronner, I believe, I'm butchering his name, back in about 1907, 1908, built a little harness that he would put on pigeons, initially to carry medicines to hospitals, but also realized he could put a little film camera on it with a timer and have it just take a few photos every few seconds. And that's really what he had started back in 1907. In World War I, it proved invaluable in just capturing reconnaissance data across enemy lines. It was also heavily used even in as late as World War II. And we've obviously come a long way since pigeon cameras, but the concept of what we're doing with aerial inspections is still the same. It's about how do you get a different perspective of an asset or a site in a way that's different than doing ground-based inspections.
Yeah, and I
Just
think
an story nonetheless.
what's crazy about that, every time I hear that story, I'm always like, there's always been a desire to just elevate perspectives and apply, kind of innovative thinking to inspecting things, right? And I think, Ted, that kind of tees you up a little bit here. Let me kind of prep just this idea of just like an inspection type. Because I think that's what's really interesting into this idea too, is once you kind of fundamentally get the idea of like, hey, what is an inspection? How do you define it? You quickly dive into the different types or the kind of means and methods that come into this. And so I'm kind of curious from your side, you mentioned, you've kind of come from the aerial side and have applied some of the ground type stuff too, but how do you kind of describe, okay, hey, you get the idea of what an inspection is. We want to go look and visually see something, but now you start to get in the means and methods of that. Like, what are some ways that you kind of find yourself explaining that to different folks?
Yeah, well, you have to start by honing in on what you're looking for, right? At the end of the day, not everything is visible with just an average camera, and every asset has its own quirks and features, especially around how to get around it and actually access those views. So, aerial makes a lot of sense because the reason we're using drones is ease of access and keeping people safe. No one needs to be put in harm's way in these cases. But ground is still equally valid because there's plenty of cases that I've encountered where a traditional ground, on your feet with the camera, or maybe like a extended selfie stick on a 360 camera, like something like this, is the best way to reach that area and capture that information. But ultimately, you can't go out and take one tool and apply it evenly to all of these cases because the cases are so different, and the situations you'll encounter in the field don't always line up with the situations that the engineer who built that platform may have thought was going to be the case. So a lot of learning and just breaking stuff, honestly, that kind of has to happen. But ultimately, once you hone in on what you need and you develop sort of a portfolio of cases that you've encountered in the past, it becomes pretty much second nature. You just kind of know what's going to work, what's not going to work, what to not even bother, and just say, hey, like, this isn't the right way. Do it the traditional way. There's nothing wrong with that. At the end of the day, we just need to keep these assets up and running and everyone's safety considered.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that is like you're kind of building your toolbox, right? Like I'm sure many of the folks that are on here listening, it's like, hey, they got a toolbox at home, stuffed in a utility closet or things like that. And really, when you think about that toolbox, it's really something you build over time, right? Like, yeah, you can go get pre-made kits, and it's got the screwdrivers, the hammers, all these things. But then you're kind of like diving into the efficiencies of like, well, what if I had a nail gun, or what if I had a laser tape measure to do my job more effectively. And we'll get into some of that crawl, walk, and run kind of towards the end here, like we typically do. But I think it just, even hearing you say some of those things, it's like, hey, like you got to realize that this isn't a one, faceted idea. There's so many concepts that get blended into this topic. But the cool part about it, I think, is really how reality capture has like truly redefined inspections and what you can do and how you can really take that from just truly a like typical hammer to like just say nail gun. That seems like it's even a bad gap to even fill in that too. But yeah, I just think that's what's really interesting about how reality capture has changed really the game and landscape of inspections, really just even in like the last 5 years. And Jay, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. And Ted, I want to kind of get to some of your examples you were talking about too.
Yeah, I'd even say it goes both ways. I mean, when you even think about a humble tool as the hammer, there's so many different ways you can use a hammer today that makes it a really versatile tool out in the field. So I think it's one of those topics that really goes both ways. There's a lot of specialized techniques, tools in the trade to allow you to do inspections, but also you might be able to use one or two or three key technologies like a hammer that might be able to get you 80% of the way there and 90% of the way there. So I would also say don't disregard some of the simple tools that might already be at your disposal that gets you a majority of the way. But also know that there's a lot of specialized tools that are available within the reality capture space for whatever type of inspection that you might be trying to do based on your asset and your site.
And maybe just to camp there, just like a little bit, like what are those tools that you would say are like some of the basic ones? Like Ted, you obviously held up, a 360 camera. I would probably throw in like a drone, obviously, into that conversation too. But like, what, from your guys' opinion, ground-based capture, simple 360 camera, aerial-based capture, drone, pretty standard and simple. Like, are there any others that you, again, like kind of tracking towards the simplicity sense? Like those seem to be the hammer and screwdriver of the tool chest.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key one there is camera. Like that's the one that keeps coming up, right? It's just your the same technology, the core technology that's in your phone that's been around with us since the film days. Uh, like that is reality capture. Video is reality capture. At the end of the day, you are documenting what you see in front of you, and it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. It can get more complicated than that if you really are looking for things, for example, that may not be visible to the human eye, such as thermography with long wave infrared or LiDAR. But at the end of the day, it doesn't have to be anything more than just a picture of a defect or even something that isn't defective. That's still an inspection, right? So it's all about choosing that right tool. But like Jay said, like that hammer, still using it everywhere. It's in everyone's tool belt, and it doesn't have to be overdone.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. Because I want to get into a little bit too, Ted, a little bit of like some of your examples here that we can kind of walk through. Like, I think when you were kind of helping break down this concept, even just when we were huddling up about this, like some of the examples you were sharing were really helpful of like, hey, when you start to think about this, and maybe we're kind of jumping ahead to the like crawl, walk, run here, but like walk through some of these examples that we're kind of looking at here, because I think this is what's really helpful for folks to maybe take it a little bit step further of like, yeah, those tools can and should be used in these different circumstances. And they are. Like, that's the reality of what's going on here. And again, there's just something so simple about you carry a camera in your pocket everywhere with you. How do you get that into more positions to do these inspections that are typically being done either by, human intervention of scaffolding or, putting someone up in these spots? But kind of walk us through some of these images that you showed as examples too.
Yeah, I like this slide because it tells a pretty good story of traditional ways that inspections can ramp up in difficulty, but also that hardship is there for drones as well. There's kryptonite for drones that it makes them difficult to position in different areas and ways. Tower capture is something that this is being done all over the world manually with people that climb that tower and rappel down it. And the thing is, that tower has mount points. It has that infrastructure built right in for that inspection that's expected to be done on a recurring basis. So on the drone side of things, on the aerial side of things, towers are also freestanding structures. They're generally away from other structures. There's a lot of area to navigate around them. And like that cell phone tower example, you can see through most of it, right? So if you need to see something on the backside, just position yourself 180 degrees on the other side and look through that lattice structure. Going up from there, you go into the dynamic structures like wind turbines, and what you see there is the tip of a blade. Those, again, built with inspections, traditional inspections in mind. Experts that do it as a full-time job, very dangerous job, but still that's what they do and they're excellent at it. Same situation there. It gets a little bit harder though, because that thing's moving. So you generally have a few more steps to take before you can just throw your drone up there and take those pictures. And a lot of the defects in those structures are beneath the surface, right? So you have to be very careful in examining it. And one thing drones can't really do effectively, but most of them, with just a camera is any form of non-destructive testing, any form of getting up and touching that surface. Up from there, you're in buildings, and buildings just have a lot of surface area to cover, with just strange winds and turbulence occurring all the time. They do sometimes have infrastructure built in to support manual inspections, but oftentimes they don't. And if that infrastructure is there, then it's very costly to deploy it and to put people on it and to run that inspection. So buildings also a little bit more difficult for drones because that turbulence and that proximity to the surface really does complicate the way that drones navigate. So you have to have, the right tools for that job as well. And then number 4 is not pictured here, but bridges. Bridges are just the most difficult. This is an image from a 360 camera that I stuck inside of a bridge truss. So there's a lot of things about bridges that you can't see with the drone or from the outside in, period. There's really no way, even if you were there on foot and tried to stick your head in there. So this isn't a good example of where drones fulfill maybe 80% of that, and they're getting much better at it thanks to autonomy and really great obstacle avoidance and not having to rely on GPS. But there's still other tools in that tool belt that get you access into very specific locations on the bridge, which are typically also really important components, really important elements of that structure that need to be observed and need to be documented. So there's just a lot going on. And actually, if you go on the next slide,
Yeah, I love this slide too. I think this definitely dictates a lot of the inspections you have to do.
Yeah, this is just a screenshot from an inspection manual, like an official bridge inspection manual that we use for structures here in Canada. And this is like one of 8 pages. And you can see just like the types of damage that you're going to encounter that you're expected to document. So you kind of have to fulfill both roles if you're doing the inspection. And you want to make sure you're doing an inspection that matches what the manual says. And again, this manual is written way before drones. So it doesn't even take into account the technology, but this is still something that they've been looking for this whole time. So we need to match it or exceed it. And there's just a lot. And every asset, think of it having its own specific manual and really, really specific and difficult to understand in some cases, classes of damage.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing I want to kind of ping you about, Jay, very well said, Ted. I think a lot of people don't realize how regulated inspections are. I mean, just go watch the news. Maybe you've heard of some bridge collapses of recent, and why regulation around inspections are just becoming way, way, way more stringent, which they should be. I think what's interesting though is like the need for both ground and aerial data to be in the same platform or to be in the same, just call it tool. And maybe a little plug here, Jay, like talking about how combining both ground and air is like really, really important because you are inspecting something from this perspective. And then you also need kind of what you said with the, stick the 360 camera in there to see the whole perspective. Like I'm sure you hear a lot of that, Jay, as well from a lot of customers and just folks in the industry. But why is that so important other than the surface level? Like, yeah, that just makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think, especially for those of us that have been in the drone industry for a while, it's easy to fall into the trap of, let's talk about the cool and next exciting new type of drone or aerial hardware you can use for whatever it is you're trying to inspect. But the whole goal of this conversation, it's about how do you inspect the type of asset that you need to inspect at the end of the day. It's about using the right tool for the job. It's not about what kind of drone is the right type of drone for you to use for that job. It's not about saying, do I need to use a specific type of LiDAR and LiDAR platform or 360 captures. And so increasingly what we've heard from our customers is, look, we have a variety of different assets. We need to inspect those assets. We're going to use the best tool in our toolbox to inspect those assets, whether it's LiDAR, 360 cameras, or fixed cameras, or using drones at the basic level. And so it's more important to say, okay, can we consolidate our inspections in a single tool that allows us to leverage our full toolbox of reality capture solutions and hardware that allows us to conduct those inspections. And that's really the core of it. For those of us that have been in the drone industry for a while, you've probably heard of companies come and go over the past 5 to 10 years. And the companies that have done well are those that have focused on the problem that we're trying to solve, ultimately being able to conduct the inspections that you need to conduct, as opposed to being focused on the technology and the next coolest hardware or software or tech that goes with it. So if it doesn't solve the problem first, it doesn't matter how cool the technology is. It's got to be able to solve the problem.
Yeah, well said. And I think that's why even from some of these other conversations we've had a couple weeks ago, we talked about robotics and like, what's the reality of going on there? And there's just some really good, impactful quotes of like, hey, you're asking maybe the wrong questions. Like, let's talk about what is the solution that you're needing, or what is the application that you're applying this to. And I think when you're starting there, that has just such an impact to really dive into getting the most value out of what it is that you're using. So Ted, I kind of want to turn it over to you. I'm going to move a slide here and kind of bring this back up again. But you talked a lot about, bridges is kind of being the fourth and probably, and I agree, most complex, amount of inspection going on. What does make them so difficult? And I have a couple thoughts I want to add, but I'm sure you're going to add to it where, you don't have building maintenance units or, attach points on some of these bridges, which just makes it incredibly tricky, to do these inspections. And you have a couple great examples here I know you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, bridges are difficult for a multitude of reasons. They're not just difficult to get inside of and look at. It's also just a factor of just how many things or how many surfaces and weird geometry you have to look at. Also, the types of materials involved there. So this is just a couple of images to kind of reference that. This is how we were doing inspections a few years ago from the outside looking in. And when you have thousands of images of the same structure, everything starts to look the same. Like, there's a spandrel there, concrete arch, but where is that arch? Like, where is that spandrel? If there's something that is of a significant, priority to look deeper into, then you kind of need to localize where that problem is. And then ultimately, all of that information needs to be documented and cataloged somewhere. So if you want to show the next slide,
Yeah.
that is kind of what today is standard as a bridge management platform, right? A structural catalog of Excel spreadsheets, PDFs, and a whole lot of like Windows 95 app UI. But that's the reality, and you have to appreciate that the DOTs and the asset owners, this is what they have. Like you can't really expect them to fully adopt things like 3D right away, even though it is more beneficial, because at the end of the day, they still need to input that information somewhere, and it needs to go through the flow of what their expectations have to be. And I mean, video kind of. I love 3D, but to be honest, in my experience, one of the most efficient and effective ways to inspect bridges and a lot of assets actually is still just video, right? It is reality capture. It is a documentation of the current state. But at the end of the day, it does kind of help with that situational awareness, right? The inspector or anyone else watching the video can then watch through the video and see how that aircraft or how that operator navigated and where they started and where they were when they saw that defect, and they can stop and they can extract frames from it, and that's as good as a picture. So it's 90% of the work is just done right there. And then ultimately cost is a big factor too. If you do want to make 3D reconstruction, then you have to collect images effectively to do that. So in a lot of these really, high volume cases, such as bridges, because they have to be inspected all the time, you have to choose not only the right tool, but also the right medium or the right data collection method matters. Because ultimately we're here to improve the status quo and make it more efficient. We're not going to succeed if we're adding cost and complexity to these already occurring missions.
Yeah, and even just to give a quick shout out too. I mean, these are incredible drone flights into these spaces, and I know you've done a lot of great work in showcasing, Skydio and a couple other products that are out there. Like, just even for the viewers that are watching this, like this is a video, right? This is not a 3D reconstruction. Yeah. This is a good example, and I love what you brought up there too, because I think that's really important. Is that a lot of people think, oh, well, just go to 3D reconstruction. That's got to be the best. That's got to be, where I can do everything. And that is a good place to go if that is, again, in your goal in mind with reporting, and visibility, and sharing and all that stuff. But I think we all probably started in the video realm of, hey, we're just going to go out there, take a video as if I was up on that ladder or up on that swing stage to see some of that. And so, yeah, I think this was just crazy about, I think just some of this content you're sharing here is like, this is a video. And I love what you said about putting yourself into that space, right?
It just came from this little guy, right? So it's also about scale. Like, this should be in the inspector's toolkit. It should be in the back of their truck. It's just like that pair of binoculars or that crack gauge that they have with them as well. There's there's really no reason not to, because ultimately you're seeing things that may one day turn into life or death situations, especially with bridges. And video, video is pretty flexible too. You can make 3D
Mm-hmm.
reconstruction from video. 3D reconstruction works effectively on anything that has overlapping images. And there's tons of images in a single frame of video that could be done with. So, of course, it's not going to give you the same results as photos, but you have that option there. And that's the really great thing about the flexibility that reconstruction gives you. Is you don't have to do that now, but if you need to later, it's there, right? So you choose what you need, and then you go with that.
Yeah, and it's a good point too. I think, oftentimes I've heard, and we're not in the misconceptions part of this yet, but I wanted to just kind of maybe note is like, hey, autonomy is taking away from the craft of inspection, and autonomy will just phase out people who can fly and operate these things. And I think we all kind of know, like, hey, the reality of it is like, to be an experienced pilot will never go away. Like, you're always
Mhm.
going to need to go up and inspect something that maybe you don't program the mission to. I just think sometimes that gets
Mhm.
lost in this a little bit, and that's why I love just even what you're saying about the video side of it. Is just like, hey, at the end of the day, you still have to be a really experienced pilot, and it really to be an
Yeah.
experienced inspector.
No one that's spent full days and weeks under bridges with drones is going to complain about autonomy. Nobody. It's honestly, it's not a fun place to be, and even mentally, it is very draining.
Mm.
You are just so tuned into that, that position that you're in. You're accounting for all these factors. It's not worth the money, to be honest. It doesn't pay that well either, because these things are everywhere. Like, we need to get them inspected. We need to be efficient, and autonomy enhances that. It doesn't take away
Yeah.
from any skill or special classification that you have. And ultimately, there's skills involved there that are just new skills that you'll have to adapt to. And there's a difference between someone that has never used something that's autonomous to someone that has only been using autonomous from day one. So there's new skills. Don't worry, there's lots of stuff to learn. Um, you're not going to run out of that. And no, the drone is not going to take your job. And if it takes your job, you're probably thankful that it did.
Yeah, hey, that is the quote. I think I have an applause. There it is. Maybe there. I was waiting to use that one, but it is so true, and I think it's just really helpful to understand that in context too. Because I guess Jay, because I want to transition a little bit here too, because we get asked this a lot, right? Like, why is 3D reconstruction of these images so important? And you can see this image here of where all these images were taken and how you can kind of go back and re-navigate some of these, but for maybe someone that doesn't know the value of the 3D reconstruction, similar, or I would say on the other end of just the video side of capture, like why do you hear a lot of folks asking about 3D reconstruction, the value that it brings?
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to the comment, Ted, you made earlier around context. You need to have context around where that specific issue occurred and be able to go in and identify that and be able to resolve that issue. I was just on site with a customer earlier today, uh, who was talking a lot about. We actually did a drone flight with them for the first time, and they were asking us a ton of questions around, as we're doing this facade inspection on the side of the building, can we, pause and zoom in and take a look at this one specific issue that we'd identified? And we said, sure, you can do all of that, but wouldn't it also be better to do that, when you're back in your office with a team of 10 other inspectors that are all looking at different aspects of the model or different aspects of your building, and be able to do that inspection as a digital snapshot at a moment in time, as opposed to live in the field. And so it's kind of the one to many approach. If you are one person that's out in the field that's capturing data at that time, like even for a video, for example, you should know what you're looking for, and you should be knowledgeable about what are the types of defects or issues that you're looking to find. Versus a 3D reconstruction allows you to have that one to many effect of saying, have one person that's knowledgeable about how to reconstruct a site or an asset as realistically as possible, and then sharing that out with a group of specialists that can use that model to be able to inspect whatever it is they're trying to inspect. That means for something like this, you can have someone who specializes in looking at cracks and structural defects and try to understand how that can impact the structure. But you can also have a civil group that might be looking at the pavement on top of the bridge itself, that might want to use it for a different inspection or a different piece of work that they might be doing. So having that model means you can have a larger group of people use that digital visual twin snapshot that you've created at that moment in time for whatever it is they're looking to do, without relying on that original operator to capture the exact photos at the exact location that they needed, or the exact video at the exact location that they needed. But again, this goes back to our earlier comments. It's about using the right tool for the job. And a tool isn't just a drone. A tool is also the data outputs that you'd expect. A photogrammetry visual model is a necessity in certain scenarios, but it isn't the only tool at your disposal. To Ted, your comment, a video might be the right tool for you. A photo might be the right tool for you. A LiDAR scan, which we'll talk about later, might be the right tool for you. But there's specific scenarios where a photogrammetry model can be really valuable, and that's something that we see many customers start to adopt, especially with aerial data, because it gives you context on some of these large and massive sites where you might be taking thousands of different images, but now you've got geospatial context of where that issue exists or where that asset exists because you've got a visual twin of your site.
Yeah, and I would add to that one thing that photogrammetry also does is exposes errors in coverage. So if you are doing that inspection with video and you stop, you see something, you zoom in close, you explore it, and then you continue on your merry way, there's a very high likelihood that there's maybe something nearby as well that during your time that you were so focused on that one target, that target fixation, that you may have kind of not paid attention to your surroundings and missed something a little bit more important. Because when there's a damage, there is generally other damage that's associated to it. These aren't sort of singleton events. These are things that really are correlated to each other, and those patterns are also extremely important. So when you're tasked with doing a 3D reconstruction, really you have to collect everything or it won't work. And in those areas where you didn't collect everything, you just have big holes in your data, and it's very clear and right away obvious that you missed something, and you don't really have that double check possible with video without really scrutinizing that video and spending more time than you should have watching it.
Well said. And I think the interesting point about that too is that that is where autonomy comes in. Like when you need that coverage and when you need kind of call it that superpower of coverage and making sure that you did get all that, like, man, kudos to SkyDeploy, which we have some really fun examples I know you want to show too, is like, that's where that helps, like you're giving it its parameters, you're helping it understand, hey, this is what I'm wanting to inspect. And so help me get the coverage that I need to do that. You obviously don't have to be an incredible expert, but I'm going to ping here a little bit. Nick had an awesome note here in the comments, just like, hey, interpretation is a skill set that's not going anywhere anytime soon. And man, kudos, and I completely agree, Nick. That's so true. And I think that again is oftentimes what gets overlooked as we have these conversations, because everyone wants to talk about the newest and the latest and greatest, but it's like, hey, like at the end of the day, the very core of what an inspection is interpreting something, interpreting the real world that you're wanting to visually understand. And so, man, this is great. You got something you want to add?
Good analogy there. Sorry if I broke up. I think a good analogy there. Teachers talking about even in schooling, how do you take advantage of AI tools that might enable students? Think about like calculators versus graphing calculators and a lot of advanced computations that computers can do today. Just because we've removed the ability for most people to have to do math by hand and do these calculations by hand doesn't mean that that's become a job that was replaced by a mathematician who used to do that work before. It's just a lot more efficient about what it is that we're looking to do, because it's helped all of our lives to be able to run calculations quicker. It's the fact that you can fly a drone today and get a 3D model without having to calculate camera positions and focal lengths and be able to reconstruct these on your own. Kind of at the end of the day, it's a tool that allows you to, it's an automated tool that allows you to get to the output that you need, the answers that you need, as opposed to something that you should feel threatened by.
Yeah, and I think too, one thing I didn't even realize as we were putting these slides together is like, I love that you started with bridges, Ted, of like, hey, if you can inspect a bridge, you can inspect just about darn near anything, because they are so tricky and complex. And, I just wanted to highlight one of the projects that I think, you've utilized DroneDeploy in, and kind of just the uses that it's really shown a ton of value in. So kind of walk us through this example. Like this is clearly not a bridge, it's a building, clearly covered and sprinkled with all these different captures that happen. But just why was this such an effective tool in the kind of process of what you did to capture this building?
Right. So this was a building envelope assessment, and the challenge here is efficiency, of course. Again, this specific inspection type. It's going to be done with any drone. It doesn't have to be a SkyDeploy. It can be done with a Mavic, etc. But with those tools, you may need to spend more time on site. You may need very specifically high skilled pilots and operators. And I opted to use the SkyDeploy here because I was there myself. I had one day to do it. And I needed to take advantage of that. And ultimately, I also never really planned to create a 3D model with it, but it turned out that I had all the ingredients. It had already been collected. And I actually struggled with the 3D reconstruction of this one for a few different reasons. And I found DroneDeploy to actually have a really good result. And, counter to what I personally believed beforehand, because, DroneDeploy, I thought mapping, right? But at the end of the day, photogrammetry is photogrammetry. So as long as that data is collected consistently and the coverage and the overlap is where it should be, then it will work. And that's just one of those things that automation, like what 3D scan does on the drone, is so key. It handles that math for you. You still need to have some expertise and some general knowledge of what you need it to do. But at the end of the day, the result is much more valuable than what you would have accomplished had you not sort of prepared yourself for these types of deliverables. And ultimately, like the task was completed, and above and beyond that, now that is a historical representation of what that building was like in a specific state and time. And there's actually a building being constructed next to it. And during that construction of the new building, if there was any disturbance, or there was something that occurred that led to damage on this building, your proof is irrefutable, right? You have it captured completely because of this work that was done. So it starts to pay off down the road, and a lot of people kind of look at it at face value as just purely for inspection. But there's more value to unlock later on in that asset's life cycle. And then you start repeating this maybe yearly or biannually, and then really starts to shine there as well.
Yeah, and I think if there's a tool that's out there, Ted has tested it. Maybe you need to hashtag yourself Ted tested in some way. But I think what's just funny about it is, and I think that's why a lot of people engage on your posts and just appreciate the content that you're putting out, which is why we wholeheartedly wanted you to come in and talk on this topic, is because there are a lot of tools. We've talked about hardware and tools on that front, but there are a lot of tools on the software side, right? And being able to test and see like, hey, this may be a better tool for this, or this may be a better tool for that on the processing side. But I love what you said on, hey, photogrammetry is photogrammetry. At the end of the day, if you have the overlap, if you have the coverage you need, it was great to see, how DroneDeploy kind of performed in comparison to some of those other platforms, and just need to see. But I wanted to kind of chime in here too. This video here, let me see if I can cue it up here, also got a lot of interest from a lot of people. Of just, holy cow, now we're able to do this on the inside of spaces. And so kind of walk us through what this was, why we did it, or why you guys kind of chose to, really throw the kitchen sink at this hangar in particular.
Yeah, this one is interesting. This one took me a lot of time, because this was actually around the time that indoor capture for 3D scan hadn't been released yet, and I was testing it for the team. And I work at this hangar, and I always wanted to scan it. But it's one of those things, because it's inside, and because it's such a large area, doing it manually or with any drone, even before 3D scan for indoor capture was available, was challenging, because there's just a lot of weird geometry. There's a lot of edges. There's a lot of corners and nooks and spaces. But ultimately, it's the perfect case study for an indoor data set, because there's a lot of variability. There's pipes, there's flat surfaces, there's roof, there's all kinds of different materials involved as well. So this took me a day. with the SkyDeploy, and the way to do this was to break it up. So again, photogrammetry is photogrammetry. It doesn't matter how many days it takes you to do it, or how many, in a calendar, if you visited once a week to collect it all. As long as nothing really moves too much, you can chunk it out and you can collect, one corner and then move over to the next corner and the next corner and the next corner, etc. So in combination of all of those chunks, this was about 8,000 images. And it was probably one of the largest models that I had processed, but it was also one of the most challenging models that I had processed because there were so many unique angles that were captured, right? So top down is relatively straightforward, but as soon as you get into these oblique views, those are views that are horizontal or upwards, then bringing all those together and turning those 2D images into a 3D volume can be quite challenging. It's not trivial for any software to do. So I ran that through a suite of software, especially photogrammetry software, right? So you have to test the hardware, but you really also have to test the software. And there was a degree of variance between them. Some of them missed some cameras in specific areas, others missed cameras in other areas, and I won't name names, but I think you've seen the DroneDeploy model. I was happy with it. I was pleasantly surprised.
Non-paid
And
endorsement.
the thing,
Want to make sure.
non-paid, yeah, absolutely, totally. And the other thing is that it's very hands off, which for a lot of people that really matters. Like, I'm a hands-on kind of person with this. I want to get in and see how this works and how I can enhance it and make it better. But I'd say the wide majority of the market just wants it to work. And that's kind of the beauty of DroneDeploy, is that for those people, it's most likely the best option, because just throw it in and wait for that email that it's been done, and eventually you'll get your result.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up too, and kind of simplicity in action, right? We talked about simplicity kind of being the heart of why we're doing some of these, but that is true. Like, hey, there are great tools out there that have a wide range and spectrum of how much you want to get your hands on and really fine tune and detail some things out. But yeah, on the DroneDeploy side, we've kind of seen the niche of what some people are interested in. And I want to transition a little bit to Jay for you. Like, we've talked a little bit about some misconceptions that you hear kind of around this topic of inspections, just kind of in the conversation itself. But are there any we haven't covered? Because I want to get to the end here, which is what I think is going to be some really good stuff of just kind of a crawl, walk, run. But before we get there, like, misconceptions, like, what do you hear from people just to kind of that bubble up from time to time?
I think there's a couple different aspects we've already touched upon today. One is figuring out what is the right tool. When I say tool in this case, even hardware that works for that inspection or not. I used to work for a company before DroneDeploy, where we had customers asking us to be able to do hail detection and hail damage on top of roofs. In most of the country, you probably have asphalt shingles, and you're looking for damage on the shingles itself. And what we learned after 4 or 5 painful years of trying to solve that problem is that it is an incredibly difficult challenge to use drones and just even photos to be able to document. You could send 2 roof adjusters out to go and do an inspection of a roof, and they can provide 2 very different results of what is hail damage and what is wind or other kinds of damage. And so I think that's important. Again, to our earlier comment, make sure you're using the right tools for the job. A photo itself may not be the right solution for that kind of inspection. Maybe you'll have to use something else tactile, or maybe there's still is a physical component to that inspection to actually complete that inspection. So it's important to understand, what do you need to do? To Ted's comment earlier, read the user manual, the inspection manual for what needs to be inspected, and determine if that's the right tool and methodology for that inspection. Don't just assume that you'll automatically get the data that you need, even with a 3D model reconstruction, to be able to conduct the inspection.
And ultimately, the subject matter expert should be making that final call, right? In all of my bridge inspections, I'm there, but there's also a bridge engineer right beside me for the whole span of that time that I'm there, right? Just in case. So from my perspective, I'm there to ensure that the data is collected so that they have everything they need. But from a structural perspective, there's a lot more than just looking for cracks and patterns. Concrete does some crazy things, both chemically and structurally, and it's such a unique material, and we're not there to be the ultimate decision maker on the asset and the level of the condition today. It's those subject matter experts. We're just there to collect the data in a complete and efficient way. I agree, engineers should have their own drones, but engineers have other things to do. Like, that's a very overqualified drone pilot at the end of the day. So it's not always the right choice. And, that's where the drone service provider steps in. And there's tons of cases of this being the best way to do it. It's about dividing and conquering these things.
Yeah. I think one misconception, even just hearing you guys talk through that just kind of bumbled up, that came to mind, is like the misconception that you have to like be perfect at this to really get started. I think, and Ted, maybe you could add to this too, like you learn so much just going out and doing it. Like we've said this a couple times on this, is like simply start simply. Like, I don't think that you have to find yourself fully equipped, fully educated, fully understanding of all. Like, you could read that manual left and right and still miss something and be like, oh, I got to go back out there. I got to go do something. Like, that really is the purpose of why we're doing this, is like the best way to grow is to help educate yourself with really smart people who have, learned those lessons along the way. And I just feel like that's a big misconception on inspections, or just thinking that, hey, they got it all together and they have all their, I's dotted and T's crossed, and they, eventually go out and, find something that they missed, and don't see that as like a learning opportunity more so than just like an actual, frustration of like, oh, I missed something, today. But I want to get to this point. This is my favorite part of when we do these, which is just this idea of crawl, walk, and run. And Ted, I'm going to tee it over to you here, because you really had some great things as we were talking about what we wanted to talk about in kind of this segment. And really, how do you help folks go through this idea? Crawl, walk, run. The idea here is just like, hey, you've heard all this stuff. This is great, but where do I start? Or how do I keep walking? Or where do I want to run? I want you to kind of walk through these terms that you picked out for us here, because one, fidelity, not one that I probably use in my everyday vocabulary, but one that I think is really important. And as you were describing it to me, just how you kind of think about these things too.
Yeah, I put that first. And what I mean by that is, like, are we sure that what we're looking for is going to come up in the data that we collect? Right. This is a common one, is cracks. And of course, we're looking for sub-millimeter detail. It doesn't mean that you can take a picture from any angle and you have lots of megapixels and you're going to still see that crack. There's just so many other environmental conditions and even lighting, access, etc. They all come together to kind of make it possible, or in some cases impossible, to even see. So making sure that before you really dive in and start promising the world with this technology, is that that it will work, it will come through, and you will see the things that you're looking for, and you're also prepared to make changes to make that happen in the field. After that's settled and you've convinced, and of course, like, engineers are a very, very picky bunch, and they will scrutinize absolutely everything, and that's completely fine. There's a lot to scrutinize there. After they've done that scrutiny and they're happy with what they think the result will be, then you have to drive adoption. You have to really show that, look, this is done scalably. This is done at a reasonable cost, and this is something that is going to have long-term value and save money and lives down the road. And then once both of those check marks are hit, then it's a question of scale. Like, there's a lot to inspect. There's a lot to do. How do we do it efficiently and effectively? So it would be, I think, not in your best interest to pick one of those other two, like adoption and automation, first, and then encounter that, well, this isn't really even working in the first place. You really have to verify that the results are worth all of that trouble.
Yeah, well said. And I think why I liked those words, because I think it's just relatable, right? Like, there are different parts of where people are at in the process to really say, hey, like, I'm just trying to make sure that using this different tool in this different way is going to get the job done, because I don't want to go out there and have it not prove to be that in kind of the fidelity side. And adoption, there's a lot of people to convince that these are the right tools, these are the right ways to go about doing and addressing this. And then eventually on the automation piece, I want to, Jay, kind of get to something from your side. Something that we get asked a lot is just, hey, this is a lot of information to now digest and consume. There's so much stuff that I'm, not just maybe one or two photos that I did a normal inspection with, but I have thousands and hundreds of thousands of photos. And now I have to sift through all those things. Like, I know you were agreeing with Ted a lot with the automation piece being kind of the really running side of this kind of segment. But like, when you hear and see some of these things, like, tell us a little bit about how automation plays out, maybe from the analysis side, because there's a lot of ways you can go about doing that, but just some of the examples you see the most value coming out of.
Yeah, like you mentioned, once the customers have really good programs and models, I heard this come up in a few different talks that I listened to at Commercial UAV as well last week, where there's like, we've got terabytes and petabytes of data. The real solution for us now is how do we analyze that data at scale to be able to do whatever it is they're looking to do on some of these larger projects. And so this is even where we're starting to dip our toes at DroneDeploy, is how do we help you automatically identify those specific objects or issues or assets, not to solve your problem entirely. We're not the experts at the end of the day. You and everyone who's on this call are more experts in your individual fields than we are. But how do we give you kind of a cruise control tool that allows you to identify those at scale and then be able to track those issues or track changes in those issues, interpret what that means ultimately for your job. So this is just two examples. The one on the left is for a customer actually out in, I believe, somewhere in Africa, where they're trying to be able to identify the buildings themselves and the changes in the buildings in this neighborhood, and some of the annual captures that they're doing. And the example on the right is for a orchard farm, where they're trying to identify yield productivity for specific seeds and being able to identify what their production levels look like by being able to automatically identify and count those trees that are at a certain maturity level. And again, you can imagine this is something that's incredibly manual. I talked to a customer about this a few years ago, and they said, they'd hire a high school kid out of college, just go and walk this field for 4, 5, 6 hours, depending on the size of this field, with a clicker and just manually click in how many trees they can see out in the field. It's just not a scalable solution, and something that drones in conjunction with an automated analysis tool allows you to be able to quickly get the answer.
Yeah. And then Ted, I know I want to get to this too. This is probably some of your most engaged content that I've seen of just like the automation of the analysis. Like, this is stuff that is incredibly exciting, I think, is why probably a lot of folks are so interested in it. But just kind of before we close out, like, what's some of your perspective on, hey, if you are having these processes built in and you're kind of in that run phase with automation, like, just what excites you as you're seeing some of this stuff? Because it's not just about partnering with someone that is combining and putting all this in the same platform with ground and air data. It's not about just being able to use tools in different forms. Like, this is the future. Like, this is today. This is what people are asking for, and partnering with those companies that are actually doing it and are listening to folks based on the needs that they have.
Yeah, I think, interestingly, some of the seemingly most simple and straightforward, tasks or challenges turn out to be the most difficult to do. And I think AI is definitely one of those, and specifically like the computer vision, machine learning aspect of it that can be applied to images. The reality is that there's just so much variation between these data sets, and that data set ultimately is the main factor into the quality of the inference or the estimation of what that object is or what that defect is. So AI, I think we're kind of in the very early stages of seeing it applied at scale. The data sets are getting better. Companies have been accumulating them for a while and training solid models, but there's still a lot to improve on. Ultimately, it also has to be worth the cost. Spinning up GPUs is not cheap, and everyone's doing it all at the same time right now. So kudos to DroneDeploy, honestly, for having, I think, the vision to see this coming a long time ago. I think one of those things that it is hard to fully appreciate is just the amount of data that DroneDeploy ingests. and has insight into. And again, like that's the key problem here, is that there's just so much variability. You can make an AI model that spots trees, but now try to make something that spots cracks and do that across bridges and roads and other structures, and you're all of a sudden getting results that are not, any way better than what you were done manually, even from a cost perspective and time that it takes that engineer to do so. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I definitely love the application. I think it's a no-brainer, but there's a lot of proving left to be done, and there's a lot of variability in the results as well.
Yeah. And I think what's great too is like rising tide raises all ships. Like when you see the industry going in this direction, you get excited because you kind of start to catch the vision of like, whoa, what other ideas are people putting out there? What are some of the things that could be applicable to what I'm doing? And yeah, I think you summarized it really well. It's like, it's exciting to see this. And you also want to see it being, actually used and applied into the scenarios that you're trying to put it into as well. So Jay has a flight to catch. I said this was live and he said, hey, you got to end this at the top of the hour. I want to do, I got to get on my flight. So I think I'm doing pretty good. I'm looking at my clock up here too, but fellas, just thank you guys. This is just, I know, a treat for not only myself and our team that gets to, put these together, but also the folks that are tuning in. There are a lot of questions and comments that are in the chat section. And the only reason with going right up to the top is that we found that a lot of folks just like to engage and ask questions in the comments. So I would encourage you guys to go and answer those as you see some of them after we wrap up here. But I'm going to have a couple quick announcements before we wrap up. But thank you guys for coming in here. It's always fun to get to chat with you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Well, the last couple things that I want to note is if you are interested about more of this information and you want to see it in person, meet individuals, Jay and his team will be at our user conference, which is coming up in about 25 days. I think if I looked at my countdown right, and he will be there. And we actually do have a discount code available for you guys to get a little bit off that ticket price. If that is something that you guys are interested. There are going to be a lot more Reality Capture Live guests that are there, and would encourage you guys to go and check that out. Really the experts around this idea of reality capture and in the aerial space are just super excited to be able to get to engage and interact with you guys as you come and engage with us. And so appreciate your guys' time. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you guys get a lot out of these conversations. We'll see you again here in a few weeks. We are still finalizing the topic. We have a couple in mind that we've gotten some great feedback on. And so if you have ideas, let us know in the comments section below. Reach out to us, and we would love to engage and bring up those topics again soon. So we hope this was a good time. Thank you all for tuning in and sticking with us, and we will see you next time. Take care.